So a few simple things. Hopefully everybody got a chance to get a bite to eat. It's paid for by Metabolon. I got my bosses tricked into feeding you. So one of them is here, so you know you had a chance to hear that. Anyway, so we have a guest network. So if you really need to interrupt your time traveling and check your email or something like that, the guest network can be accessed with. And if you can't remember it, no guest password for you. So we're going to have the lecture setting at the beginning, and after the lecture, we'll do a short description of a few folks here that you might be interested in talking to, like Tim, who's the in-house recruiter. He helped with a considerable amount of organizing for this. And then we also have door prizes that we're going to raffle off. We have cups. If you didn't get a ticket already, we have some raffle tickets that we're planning to pass out. I'm sure everyone will make their way to you. We also have some.
We haven't distributed yet.
Okay, so to be distributed, perhaps at the end. We'll do a drawing for them, and then we have notebooks for you if you didn't win one of the cups. So I'm sure a lot of you saw this and were wondering, like, what the heck is he talking about, right? Just real quickly walk through the agenda. So the first thing I plan to do is to kind of break down each one of the statements that I'm making so that you can understand whether I am or am not making good on my claim, that I can help to illuminate what I'm talking about here. So I'll decompose what I mean by writing declaratively. I have a code example, so it's not just all hand-wavy that this works in theory. I'll show you an example of code that was done this way. And I'll actually show it done a different way first, the way that you might do it if you weren't doing it declaratively, and then I'll show it to you declaratively, and you'll see that the thing that you end up at is most likely very different. The other thing I'll talk about is what I'm talking about when I say harnessing the power of the universe. Sounds like a very bold statement, but you actually, you'll see what I mean, and I'll break that down. And even more crazy might be this one, time traveling into the future. I'll break that down, talk it through, and by the end, hopefully you'll agree that I've made it. I'll provide some warnings. So it's time travel. It's not completely safe. There are some caveats that you should be aware of. And then lastly, I'll provide what I consider some key takeaways. You may have your own. So before we get into that, though, I had a quick poll. How many people came to eat, laugh at the presentation, but then try for a door prize and call it a night? So I see a couple of honest people here. Everybody else, you may not sit next to my wallet, okay? All right, and one thing I promise you is at the end, you may not be convinced, but you won't be laughing. So, okay. So what do I mean by write declaratively? Writing. It's to set down in writing, such as to express it in literary form, right? This is a means of communication. So, and declaratively, I have a couple of definitions of declaratively. So this one is kind of the dictionary definition of declaratively. So this comes from the declare, is to make known formally, officially, or explicitly. To make known is a determination. For example, the judge declared the defendant fit to stand trial. She was declared the rightful heir to the throne. To make evident, and to state emphatically. And so one thing you might see kind of as a theme through all of these is kind of there's a statement of boldness that's being made about the word declare. So there's another way of talking about declaratively in the frame of programming, and that's the programming style where you talk about logic and you talk about it in the relationships of how things happen and less about the discrete way in which you tell the computer to do steps. So I thought it might be helpful before going through the example code that I have to talk through the example problem set. So the statement of the problem, and you may be wondering if this is a screenshot from code that we have here. Resembles a screen that we have here, but it is not the screen that we have here because I wasn't sure if I could get that passed through all the legal stuff. So this is a similar screen from a different product. But in this, you can see there's a scatter plot graph, and there's a bunch of data, different shapes, and all of this sort of stuff. What if you zoomed into this graph and you saw less than the whole graph, right? Then if you were drawing some sort of selection on the points to say, I have an interest in performing a user activity against some of these points, it wouldn't make sense to allow you to select outside of what you can see. So the window frames what you can do, right? But you don't want an error on the user. It doesn't make sense in this particular case to say, oops, you went over the boundary, you're just done, right? But you want to kind of constrict them, kind of snap it in. All right, so in this sample code, that was the kind of problem set that was being solved. And there's not a whole lot of secret sauce being shown here, so if you think we're going to show you all the metabolite testing here, I can do that. All right. So this was the code in question that was trying to solve this problem. Now, how many people looked at this and thought instantly, I know what that does? Not a whole lot of people, one person. So what reasons might you have, just asking for your own opinion, why would you look at this and say that you didn't immediately understand it? What do you think?
No comments.
Comments? Okay. Anybody else? Generic names? Okay.
A lot of conditions.
A lot of conditions, right? So you're trying to mentally follow all the paths you're in?
Well, I can make an assumption, but you could turn around and tell me something totally different.
Okay.
Because there isn't any documentation. So
Right, not a lot, no. I mean, you get the names,
names of, yes, right.
but that's about it, right?
I just want to say the method name is the most valuable part of this. It's actually pretty close.
Mm-hmm.
But when I read the code, it would take me forever to improve it.
Right. So I think maybe another one might be that there's kind of a inverse relationship a lot of us have to when I see a lot of code, the part of my brain that wants to read it gets lazy and says, oh, I don't have to read it, how can I skim this, right? I'll be honest, that's what happens with my emails. If I get an email from HR and it's like, you gotta read this long document, the longer, the worse I am. All right, so how many of you, if you thought to refactor this, have some idea where you would start? Where would you start?
I would probably break out the X and Y calculations.
Mm-hmm. And you?
I might start with making a point into a struct, because you probably are going to have a lot of points. You might need some performance.
Okay.
Of course, that's early optimization. You might not need to do that.
Okay. Anybody else? All right, so what occurred to me looking at this is there was a relationship forming between the way X is compared to the cliprec X, right? And that same X is compared again to cliprec X, but this time with the width, right? And so this pattern again repeats with the Y, right? Except in this case it's the Y, and instead of the width, it's the height. Okay. So if I was reading this code and I was trying to make it simpler, I would probably just me, not knowing what it does, I would try to take the patterns that it's doing and try to make something that expresses that pattern simpler. Right? So you might end up with something that talks to like this, right? I have, in one case, let me back it up a moment, the x is, if it's less than, I want this, right? So that's what we're talking to here for minimum. If something is less than, the other thing, I want the smaller one as what comes back from minimum, right? And this is a very common phrase. I'm sure like a lot of us have done min in database code and normal code. And the converse of this is max, right? Just if it's the opposite, when you compare it, if it's bigger, then I want the bigger one. Right? So talking to the patterns of lesser or bigger, you could get code that looks like this from that code. I want the lesser of the greater is kind of what's going on here. I want the lesser of the greater. I'll let that kind of sink in for a while because I looked at this for a while before I kind of saw that pattern. So comparing this code to what you saw before, how many of you would think that this code was simpler to think you're going to understand it if you saw this code versus this code? Okay? There's about 63% less lines of code, which I think helps with that.
You know what to expect out of each one too.
Mm-hmm.
Because now you have a method.
Now, if you did this, how many of you would keep refactoring this thing? You would keep doing it? That's why we hired you. I think most of us would probably say, you know what, I got a test for this stuff, it's good enough, right? You know, I'll admit that I've kind of done that in places. Now, the thing is though, that I would argue that you still don't really capture what this is doing, except for to what Derek said, just the name telling you that this is what I'm trying to do, right? You're min-maxing points and widths, min-maxing points and heights and all that stuff, right? So, if you write it declaratively, you will write it a lot differently. So, let's go back to the problem set again. If you have some kind of dimensional view, two-dimensional, three-dimensional, and you do some action to constrain it. Many of you play video games and are comfortable with the concept that's introduced into the game called clipping. Otherwise, you would just fall off the map and end up where there's nothing, right? So clipping is a very good thing in video games. This is what we're doing here. We're clipping this. Okay? Now, a clip is basically, I want to know, am I between a min and a max point? I can be any point in the middle, but if I'm less than the min, I have to be brought back to min. If I'm more than the max, I have to be brought down to max. And we're just repeating that on both x and y. And so a clip, in this case for a two-dimensional shape, is I want to put a constraint that I don't go below x or above the max x, and below the minimum y or above the maximum y. Now there is a term for this on a single dimension. Does anybody already know what that is? So there's a function that's well known. It's called a clamp. And a clamp is just used to restrict a value to a given range. And if you search on Google, you'll see that I'm not the first guy to make this up. This is used in a lot of math formulas where you need to make sure that you're within bounds. So knowing that this is a clamp, then you can say, I want a point that is clipped to a rectangle. And I would argue to you that if you were writing it declaratively, that you would do it roughly this way. And so in this particular case, I took a few liberties here. I said that I have a point, and it's being transformed here. I used a static extension method. So basically, I'm extending the library with a function that I have written, and it's in the vein of writing declaratively. The reason why this works is I'm taking an element of data and I'm doing a transform on it, which is very commonly associated as one of these kinds of methods. So if you think about a string, and I'm going to do a string write or string substring or some of those kinds of methods, it's often hung off right up the string. You don't call a method and then pass in a string. And it helps you actually to think about the direction too, that the point is then being transformed by this method. But then passed in, I get the rectangle that I'm interested in doing the clipping to. So this is an example. I just took the code that was there. I could get into that method too, but we would be here to add infinitum if I picked all the methods. But I'm just assuming that the prior version of this worked. And I'm wrapping this in a way that returns this code as data, which in the vein of writing declaratively, you'll find that it's extremely helpful to turn as many of your functions as possible into a data function. That all of your functions, as many as possible, return data. And there's reasons for that, and I'll argue them in a moment. All right, so that clip 2, it looked like I was just kicking the can down the road, but the clip 2, I mentioned, is just clamped values. And in the vein of writing declaratively, if I take a point, I have the x value, and I do a static extension method here to say I want to clamp this value. I'm going to transform it based on these values. I have a minimum, maximum, and then the current value. Right. So if you saw this code, how many of you think that as soon as you saw this code, you would immediately know what it means, what it's doing, how does it work? A lot easier? Some, maybe a few detractors. All right, so a clamp is basically I have a value, minimum value, maximum value, where I can compare them. And that's all iComparable means, is that you can do a comparison left to right. So style aside, I'm sure some people might take grievance with this like one-liner developing the formula here. I also thought that if I was going to advocate writing declaratively, that I might also advocate a slightly adjusted version of these min and maxes. And so the adjusted version of it, my statement to you is that you should not allow these kinds of low-level values come into your code. You should talk to relationships and allow your code to explain to another person what it is you're trying to do at kind of an abstract level. So whatever the correct value is for left is less than right, I don't care. But if it is that value, I want the left one. Or if left is greater than right, whatever that value is, then I want the left one. And so doing it in this way is kind of just a minor modification to the code I showed you before, but kind of still modified to this spirit of writing declaratively. So the purpose of abstraction is not to be vague, but to create a new semantic level in which one can be absolutely precise. I don't know how many of you know about Edgar Dijkstra, but the fact that we can get on the internet and packets go where they're supposed to, a large part of that is because of his work. So I think it still speaks to us today, even though he said this quite a while ago. So I talked about harnessing the power of the universe. All right, so what do I mean by harness? Harnessing is a verb, and it means to bring under conditions for effective use, to gain control over for a particular end, to harness the water power, to harness the energy of the sun. And power. Power is the ability to do or act, capability of doing or accomplishing something. So the power of the universe. This one's going to be a tough one, I think. All right, so before I explain it, it might be helpful to know some context that might help you to agree that I am explaining it properly. How many of you read self-help books? Fair number of you guys? I don't know if you noticed, but I noticed that there's kind of a theme through many, many self-help books. Besides that they all seem to successfully sell you something, whereas maybe you've not yet sold that guy something. They also seem to have a theme running through them that talks about kind of your mental state. Right? So there's one famous one that some of you might know, Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill. So Napoleon Hill, he lived until 1970. He wrote this book, Think and Grow Rich, which was, I believe currently is in the top 10 self-help selling books currently. And he interviewed Andrew Carnegie. So Andrew Carnegie had, I think even by today's standards, he was like a mega millionaire, something like hundreds of millions of dollars. And Andrew Carnegie did not start from wealth. He started very impoverished. And he was a regular, factory worker and eventually worked his way up. So another book that was written by Napoleon Hill, How to Raise Your Own Salary. This one is more directly talking about his conversations and interview with Andrew Carnegie. There's another book written by Dan Millman, The Warrior Athlete, Body, Mind, and Spirit, Self-Transformation Through Total Training. So Dan Millman, if you're not familiar with him, he is an Olympic gold gymnast, and when he was young, right after winning the gold, or right close to that, he was in a serious motorcycle accident, fractured his leg, was out of commission for a while, went through therapy and decided to re-attack gymnastics and helped his team as co-captain to win NCAA gymnast championships. Your Invisible Power by Genevieve Behrend. She studied from a man by the name of Thomas Troward, a French woman. He Can Who Thinks He Can by Orson Swett Martin. Orson is a doctor who graduated from Harvard and Boston. He, I think, published, Success Magazine, something like 1897, something like that. And then this book was pretty interesting. This is the Edinburgh Lectures on Mental Science by Thomas Troward. Thomas Troward was a judge in England about 100 years ago. And in this book, he talks about the idea of where does this power come from that you get when you focus in on something. So all of these have this idea that they're kind of conveying to you, which is either how to collect up and focus your thoughts, how to think about a specific thing, how to take that specific thing and measure your closeness to it so that you can see yourself coming closer. And so they're all trying to think and explain some way in which you use your mind to draw yourself nearer to your goals. Okay? And some of these books that you read will talk about this principle of that power working and in effect as the power of magnetic attraction. Some of them talk about it as the power of the universe. Some of them talk about it as other kinds of properties. There's even some religious faiths where they might, claim that all you have to do is think it and pray about it, and then you get it, right? It's not quite that simple, but there is some thought process behind it that is obviously working. Otherwise, so many people wouldn't be thinking that there's something to this worth publishing. Right? So, to the point of a human mind, I think it might also be helpful to explain my reasoning why this is working is if we understand a little bit about what does it take to simulate a mind. So there was a project, the NEST framework, which was done by these two folks, Marcus Diesman and Abigail Morrison. They created an artificial neural network. It was really huge. And they simulated a human brain. They believed that we have roughly 80 to 100 billion nerve cells, or as many as there are stars in the Milky Way. So 40 minutes of 83,000 processors, they were able to simulate 1 second of a human brain. 1 second. So this was in 2013, I believe. Now, using a little napkin math, this tells me that it would take roughly 201 million processors to equal your brain in real time. That might not be Amazon, but it's starting to feel pretty much like a supercomputer to me. Right? Oh, and while they were doing the simulation, it took 1 petabyte of system memory. So putting that in perspective, here's a high-end video card, GTX 1080. Has roughly 9, I think it was teraflops. So that's 1,000 teraflops, or a petaflop. There's 1,000 petaflops, or an exaflop. So I guess you can see, maybe you can't see the line here, which is where we went, right? So the scale is just vastly different from even what we would consider a high-end graphics processor. So many, many orders of magnitude different. So talking about the human mind, this fits, now that computer was enormous. The one that's between your ears, about 88 cubic centimeters, 100 billion neurons, and 1 to 2.5 exaflops. And this was according to this paper's estimate. Okay? So what I'm basically asserting to you is that the power of the universe is very succinctly defined as the focused use of your mind on a single directed objective. That's what all of these folks are basically trying to explain to you in their books. How to use your mind for one purpose. And if you think about the power of 2 million computer processors trying to find the answer to how to do something, I'm pretty sure if they could actually find the answer, they'll find it, right? And that's what each one of us has between our ears. We all were born with it. So I thought this was an interesting book. All right, so time traveling into the future. When I said this, how many of you thought of this? Yeah. You remember this movie, right?
Yeah.
You remember this guy? Well, I'm sorry to burst your bubble. We're not talking about this kind of time travel. We don't actually move from where we are and stop being here and start being in the past. All right, so let's talk about what time is. So time is a noun. It's the indefinite continued progress of existence and events in the past, present, and future regarded as well. And I think a lot of us think of time as being fixed, right? You look at your watch, you say, like, you've got a minute to go. A minute is a minute. It's not longer, it's not less. But actually, I think I might convince you it's not quite that simple. So time, if you look at Einstein's kind of some of his theories, right? One of his theories was one called time dilation. And it was that if you have two things that are moving at different speeds, they actually experience time at a different speed. Another one had to do with the gravitational pull of the Earth, right? And the amount of gravity that you experience will adjust the time. Which a lot of us know about these things, right? GPS satellites. GPS satellites, in 1989, GPS enters the first orbit, right? There's about 24 satellites, each one of them had a very precise atomic clock. With this system, it was very cheap to get roughly 15-meter location accuracy when they brought this up. Now, they can also give you local time to 50 billionths of a second. I've never needed to measure time that accurately. I'll admit it to you now. I probably never will. Traveling at 14,000 kilometers per hour, based on what we were talking about earlier, Einstein predicted that it would be roughly 7 microseconds slower. And because of the change in gravitational pull being 20,000 feet above the Earth, it's about 45 microseconds faster. So the net effect, if left uncorrected, would have been 10 kilometers a day less accuracy. So they, in my opinion, have proven that his theories are right because that's how they account for this drift. So time is not actually fixed. We experience it as an effect, but time is squishy. Okay? So there's another aspect of time, which is the notion of eternity. So where can we find notions of eternity? Well, one place, the Christian Bible has about 70 references to eternity, at least. Plato, if you follow like Platonism, Plato talks about the idea that abstract ideas can represent the most accurate reality and that they can exist across time. That they're the past, present, and future. They just exist. They just are. Right? Mathematics, some people in mathematics would say that there's a notion of truth, that you just, something is, right? You just, and you encounter it, it's just true. And past, present, and future, it doesn't matter. It just is. So there's this notion of eternity which just doesn't honor time really at all. It just says that whatever the time is, I'm there. So when we talk about traveling, traveling is a verb. It says I'm going to journey, usually of some length, or to go abroad. Right? So this, I think, is what a lot of people think of us when we think of a timeline. So when I say I want to take you from the present and time travel into the future, I think a lot of people are seeing this line and wondering, how do I make this shorter? And it's not by sending us in GPS satellites. Okay. My thought on how we get there is that the shortest distance between two points is not a line. The shortest distance between 2 points is you overlap the points and you let them exist at the same time. And that's what happens when you write declaratively. When you say that in my mind, I have seen the answer and I'm writing a statement about what the right answer looks like. So you might be wondering right now, yeah, but really, how does that work, right? How does it really work? So how many of you know what this is? What is that?
It's a neuron.
It's a neuron, right? So neuron has a nucleus, dendrites, the cell body, this myelin, and the axon terminals. There's a lot more. I didn't want to show like the really fancy one because this is the limit of my knowledge about neurons. But basically, when you're looking at a neuron, these dendrites are inputs into the neuron, and these are the axon terminals. These are the outputs, but these are actually inputs to the next neuron. These are the things that they said that we had 80 to 100 billion of them, right? And the whole point of this thing is to change the amount of signal that's coming through. So here's an artificial neural network, and that's what they did when they did this. They said, here's an input, and an input goes to all of the things that I'm connected to, and then that thing is connected to all of the things that I'm connected to, and all the direction of it is based on, how you set it up. But at the end of it, I have an output that I care about. What is the ultimate answer? How do I know what it is I'm looking for, right? And what I'm telling you is that rather than trying to work your way through here and go one layer at a time and work forward and hope you end up at the answer, if you start at the answer and then you work your way backwards to the signal, you can fill this in. And in machine learning, this is what they do. They actually have a technique for this. They call it backpropagation, where they fill in, how do I know the differences that I should do and what should I do in this layer? There is a forward pass, but the backwards part of the pass is very important. So this is how I believe that this works, is that your brain is essentially wired to say, this is the goal, this is what I'm looking for, this is the reward, this is the point. And based on these inputs that I know I have, how can I work backwards and get this? And that's what I was showing you with that declarative code. On top of that, I argue to you that most of your code should be data. It should transform data, give you data. It shouldn't make a decision. You should avoid writing code that says, do step 1, do step 2, do step 3, and each one of those is a function that doesn't return anything. Instead, you should write code that returns data, because it's how your mind is created. Your mind is created that I have all of these elements of data, and then at the end, I make a decision about it. What does that mean? What does that ultimately mean? So along with that, one last bit of evidence I have on this is that there is a book called The Addictive Brain. And in this book, he questions whether or not dopamine is actually related to addiction. There was a long time that you would call drugs dopamine, right? Because it was connected to the release of dopamine. But actually, you release dopamine naturally. So it's not like your body was created to just be addicted to drugs, right? He found, through studies that he looked at, that dopamine was being released when you were suddenly surprised by a good thing, a reward. And it caused you to have an increased stimulation in the part of your brain that learns. And so the other reason why I believe that this strategy works so well is because when you start with the answer and you say, yeah, that's it, and then you work backwards and you say, oh, yes, this thing helps, and you work backwards and you say, oh yeah, this thing helps, you're getting, I don't know about you, but when I stay up late writing programs and my wife's getting mad at me, this is why. I'm teaching myself to write this software. I'm teaching myself to be addicted to coming up with the right answers. Right? So, to that end, my proposed iteration cycle for you might look something like this. So you define the problem, you declare your answer, you create the declared answer, and then use that to create a reinforcement to learn to continue. So, I thought this was a fun quote. I won't read you the whole thing. I'm sure you folks can read this just as well as I can. Isn't this what you feel like when you write software? Like, I'm inventing a universe in here, right? That's how I feel. All right, so to the warnings. I said that there would be some, right? So my first warning to you is that you need to have the right picture. Your boss brings you in to do a thing, and he thought he was getting some simple one-liner that was going to get done in the next hour, and you're out there inventing Google. Might be a bad fit, right? So you need to talk to your customer. You need to learn their problem domain. I've seen so many talented problem solvers come in, not bother to learn the problem domain, come up with brilliant answers that will never work. You should assume that you know nothing. It was really easy when I came here. I knew nothing about metabolite testing. In fact, I didn't know anything about biochemistry. I had a lot of learning. I still have a lot of learning. And you need to treat the customer's data like your own. I don't know about you, but the fastest way that a company can lose my business is to lose my data. If Google started losing emails for me, I'd find another way. So it's a little small, but this is kind of a little lighthearted. This is how the customer explained it, how the project leader understood it, how the analyst designed it, how the programmer wrote it, how the business consultant described it, how it was documented, what operations installed, how the customer was billed, how it was supported, and what they really needed. So I thought that was fun. All right, so this maybe for some of you, thankfully, the last slide. The takeaways here, my suggestion is that you boldly and clearly demand correct answers. Don't settle for trading one problem for another. Demand the right answer. Do it right off the bat. Prefer data methods. Your mind is made to prefer data. Let your mental imagery about the problem become reality. Sometimes this happens when you're least expecting it, right? You're thinking about a problem, you're chugging away at it. If you're not happy with the answer you made, you stop thinking about it a little bit, you take a shower, you come out, you're, I got it, right? So it may not happen all in one step. It may not happen in 5 minutes. But that moment where you see the answer and you know what it looks like when you find it, let that drive you to make the right reality. And the last bit that I'll give you is to know your customers so that you can come up with the right picture. So I hope you enjoyed the talk.